So the new Skaventide box has been out for a couple of weeks now, the newest and so far most expensive starter set made for either of Games Workshop's tentpole franchises, introducing Age of Sigmar 4th edition. And yes, $265 is a huge ask for a new set, especially after their last debut box, Dominion, was an unmitigated disaster at just $200 and is still pretty easy to find online for half that price, which is what I paid for it. So the real question is, how the heck can Skaventide justify not just costing the same as Dominion, but be an entire third more? Well, I gotta admit, at least they tried. So what both boxes have in common is that they contain two opposing battle forces, each getting roughly 1100 to 1200 points in models, consisting of the Stormcast Eternals versus some other guys, but including some bonus units that the regular starter boxes will not include. In the case of Dominion, it was Stormcast Thunderstrike versus Auric Kruleboyz, neither of which turned out to be terribly popular. So for 4th edition, Games Workshop tossed a Hail Mary and went with the Rats. The Skaven are actually a surprisingly popular faction. If the Orcs are the Three Stooges of Warhammer, the Skaven are the Looney Tunes, a horde of conniving screw-ups that can literally chew holes in reality, versus the Stormcast Ruination Chamber, which is the faction's equivalent of this line.
I am so tired.
Compared to Dominion, which came with only 60 miniatures, the Skaventide box includes 74. 40 of them are just rats. Just plain ol' unspecial clan rats. 4 of the Stormcast minis are just tokens, either being a pet or the cool bros carrying around the boomboxes for when it's time to throw down. Minus tokens, the Skaven outpopulate the Stormcast at a rate of 2.5 to 1. It's a similar quirk as when Dominion's 60 models, 20 of them were Hobgrots and 3 were tokens, and Stormcast were still outed at a rate of 2 to 1. In the case of Skaventide, the 14 additional miniatures get sort of gobbled up by how many dang rats there are, making it clear that the additional models are not really the pushing factor in the price point. I mean, it's not all bad. Skaven needed a line refresh anyway, and I haven't seen a single complaint about the new Grey Seer. Now, contents-wise, Skaventide is basically a combination of both the smallest and the largest starter sets that will be coming out soon, with 2 squads of infantry per army where the maxi starter only has 1, and ditching the hobby kit in exchange for an additional squad and solo unit for each side. The Skaven getting some guns, while the Stormcast roll out their most emo units yet. There's also an ongoing voting campaign between the Stormcast and the Skaven, and of course the Stormcast are getting absolutely floored, because while they are each the mascots of their respective games, the difference between the Space Marines and the Stormcast Eternals is that people actually like the Space Marines. And I'm saying that as a Stormcast main. I mean, my boy! Look what they did to my boy! Obviously, the added value is in what bonus things are included. The box itself is taller, if less fancy, but the additional components are given a little more pomp and circumstance, being contained in envelopes and small inner boxes. Also randomly in the box is a set of 6 flat 40mm bases, which I assume are meant to be used as objective markers, though I'm a little surprised we didn't get any cardboard cutout ones. Have you met us Warhammer players? We love arts and crafts projects. Like Dominion, we get a special printing of the core rulebook that consists mostly of lore and pretty pictures, with the actual rules tucked far into the back, along with a book of assembly instructions, but sadly no dice, and unlike Dominion, no war scrolls for the actual units. I assume because they want to sell you those as a special set instead. Also, no lore magazine. Instead, like how Leviathan included the mission cards, Skaventide includes the 2024-2025 General's Handbook. For those of you who don't know, in Age of Sigmar, the core rules really only contain about half of the rules for a game setup, and the General's Handbook includes the other half, getting updated annually. So it's nice getting this in the box, though the fact that it was in card form leads me to believe that this was originally going to be the War Scrolls, which were on these sorts of cards in Dominion. But hey, the War Scrolls are free online while the GHB is still $42, and its absence was sorely felt in Dominion. Also missing from Dominion was a playboard, in this case included in the box as part of the complete Spearhead Fire and Jade set. Spearhead is the Sigmar equivalent of Combat Patrol, with pre-built armies based on the faction starter boxes, and I honestly believe that this iteration of it is done so much better than Combat Patrol. There's more points to play with, reinforcements that let you bring back fallen units, and the best one of all is easier setup. The Fire and Jade set includes its own separate rulebook, a 2-player set of twist and tactical cards, a 2-sided game board, and, interestingly, a smattering of terrain pieces, doing something I have encouraged in tabletop games, campaigns with terrain, where the campaign book ships with the terrain involved in the stories, something Dystopian Wars did before this. The Fire and Jade book also includes all of the War Scrolls for every Spearhead currently available in the game, not just the ones that came in the box. This terrain sprue also includes a 3/6/9" measuring stick, so that's another thing Skaventide has over Dominion and Leviathan. I mean, just getting a board and terrain is pretty huge, means there's something I can play right away, once I find some dice. Now, I've only played one game of Spearhead so far, but I agree it was a blast. And I'm not just saying that because I was using one of the most overpowered boxes against one of the most underpowered ones. I mean, they gave me a Stormstrike Chariot. It is literally a brick you throw at the enemy front line to gummon up, and the tight quarters of Spearhead make that devastatingly delicious. Although, like I said before, the weaker Spearheads actually get balanced out by having some of those troops be able to come back and redeploy as reinforcements after they get defeated, adding another twist to the battle as you do get to pick and choose where they come in. Setup is actually really slick. First, you roll to see whose job it is to unpack the board, while the other player shuffles the corresponding twist deck, of which there are 2, one for each side of the board. Each player then gets 1 wall and 1 boulder to set up, starting with the poor sap, or defender, who had to set up the board, and the shuffler, or attacker, then does the same. I like this. I like this a lot. Probably the most confusing and anxiety-inducing part of Warhammer for me is setting up terrain, as even the rulebook, despite all of its niche cases and highly detailed rules about everything else, tells you to just trust your feelings on setup. Spearhead? 1 wall, 1 boulder, 3 inches from all sides, 6 inches from other terrain, nothing on any objective, crisp, clean, easy. Attacker sets up their army, defender sets up their army, the attacker chooses to go second because of course they do, each player draws the top 3 of their shuffled tactical deck, the top twist card gets flipped, and play begins. The game plays like normal Age of Sigmar, same basic rules and everything, only replacing command points with the cards you draw from the tactics deck. Another thing we've previously seen from Dystopian Wars, a tactics card can be cashed in to either score extra victory points or be used to perform a command. And you're encouraged to burn through these because unless you opt for a double turn, you refill your hand at the start of each round. Oh yeah, a double turn is a thing. You roll off to see who goes first each round, meaning whoever went second has a chance of then going first, essentially going twice. Keeps the battle unpredictable, and taking a double sets the opponent up to maybe take a double of their own, and I mean both sides get to fight in combat on both players' turns anyway, and like in my Spearhead game, taking a double would actually have been the wrong decision because I had a unit hanging on by a thread, and if they died in combat on my turn, then the enemy would have gotten to freely move their cavalry right up my... I enjoy how snappy this format is. The preset boards and simple terrain setup removes so much of the futzing and putzing seen in other formats, and I am personally elated that we have a game mode that feels so locked in. If I had any criticisms, it's that I wish we had a board that used the short edges as deployment. I assume that's something coming in whatever Spearhead kit follows Fire and Jade. The Spearhead kit with the rules, War Scrolls, board, cards, and terrain is available as a standalone for just $65, and even though it does not come with any fighters, it is a phenomenal game mode for way less than boarding actions. I mean, yikes. The inclusion of the General's Handbook and Spearhead kit does give the set a huge advantage over Dominion, not just in value, but sheer playability. I still say one of the reasons Dominion fell flat is that it only came with a pair of armies and nothing to do with them. Fire and Jade is also coming in the Maxi Starter, however much that winds up costing, though the Maxi Starter does not come with the standard rulebook or General's Handbook, but honestly, those are pretty cheap to find right now thanks to folks partitioning Skaventide. Speaking of partitioning, I have sometimes talked about how these sorts of starters are meant to be something you go halvesies on with a friend, and this is one of the first sets I have seen that really seems to walk that walk, as one can easily split this set down the middle between the core rules and GHB for one player and the Spearhead kit for the other, as both rulebooks include the basic rules, though they have different sets of additional rules. Either way, both players can walk home with a 1200-point army and a playable level of literature for less than the cost of a Spearhead. That said though, $132 is still a lot, and that's the result of sharing the price burden. Honestly, I still feel like somebody should take Games Workshop by the ear and insist that starter armies should not cost more than $100. Or at least have the decency to include 1,000 points. So, there's my thoughts on Skaventide. Is the price justified? Kinda. Like I said, I paid for this myself by going halvesies with someone else, so I am able to speak as somebody with financial skin in the game, and while this set did contain my first ever Liberators, they still strike me as being mommy we have vanquishers at home. But lore-wise, I do love how they are leaning into the darker aspects of the Stormcast Eternals, but either way, mine will still be clad in my signature baby blue at the end of the day. So, that's Skaventide, and it is basically carried by the fact that it comes with probably the best game mode Games Workshop has ever made for the series. Spearhead really is a combat patrol that learned from its mistakes, and if you've never tried Sigmar before, then Skaventide or the upcoming Maxi Starters seem like a way to get in that has a ton of play potential. Just be sure to split the cost with a mate. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Age of Sigmar Skaventide, and until next time, this is Kohdok signing off.